fade the music out. Hello, I like to be introed by Bruno Mars, and he's one of my peeps, you know. Hello, I'm Larry Wellikson, and I am still the CEO of the Society of Hospital Medicine, having survived almost to the very end of another SHM meeting. I hope it's been a great experience for you on a number of levels, certainly on an educational level, but just as important on a networking level. I know that I've had a selfie taken with almost everybody in the audience, and some people have held me a little tighter than we had planned, but it's a way to get up close and personal. But I've enjoyed having conversations with hundreds of you in the last 4 days. We're going to do some recognition right before we get to the speaker you came to hear. As you know, at SHM, we have a very robust research innovations and clinical vignettes competition. This year was the most posters and submissions that we've ever had. As you know, it's so large, we have to split it into 2 sessions that we do, as well as oral presentations. And I'm here to let you know who the winners were. We will not be calling them up to the stage. It's just a way to let them know. We'll be publishing this in our publications and, of course, notifying them. So the 2015 RIV Winners in Best Research Poster, it was Bradley Monash. And as you can see, it was standardizing attending rounds to improve the patient experience, a cluster randomized controlled study. The Best Research Trainee Poster was done by Atsuja Sorita, Prevalence and Appropriateness of Fasting Orders in the Hospital. Doctor, what can I eat? The Best Research Oral Session was by Ryan Grayson, who you may remember was our winner of our first Young Researcher Award, a functional impairment and overlooked driver of post-acute costs in Medicare seniors. We have a new young rising star, somebody I just met for the first time that I didn't realize was on our board, actually, Jeff Glasheen, who I was so excited to see that he still believes that he needs to have a poster to advance his career. But he won, although I think most of the voters at one time or another had worked for him. Developing frontline teams to drive health system reform. The Best Innovation Trainee Poster was won by David Medrano and his group, Enhancing Patient Engagement in Stroke Care, Developing Patient-Centered Tools. The Best Innovations Oral Session is by our good friend Cheryl O'Malley, who, by the way, is representing SHM in the process of redesigning internal medicine residency. It's a little too late for me, but maybe for the future of our specialty. But her winning innovations presentation was characteristics of inpatient glycemic control among top performing hospitals. The Best Vignette in Pediatrics was won by Anna Cristancho and Tara Whedon for When a Fever Gets Cross-Eyed. The Best Vignette for Adult was won by John Stevens and Davis Viprakasit for Leave No Stone Unturned. The Best Vignette by a Trainee was Parker Richards Hill and Jennifer Pascoe for Discharge Against Medical Advice, a Challenge in Patient-Centered Care. And the final winner was the Patient Experience category winner, a new category for us this year, Research and Innovations, and it was Suparna Duda for Building a Patient-Centered Hospitalist Culture. Let's give a round of applause for all of our winners. So, you know how people always get up and say, for a man who needs no introduction, and then they give a speech longer than the talk that the person's giving. What I will tell you is that one of the things in the society I do play an active role in is selecting and recruiting our plenary speakers. And I will tell you, there is not a conference even with an unlimited budget that will have 3 speakers as interesting and emotional and innovative and inspirational as Peter Pronovost, Maureen Massignano, and our speaker for this afternoon, Bob Wachter. These are the Mount Rushmore of performance improvement, quality improvement, change management in this country. And I requested the opportunity to introduce my good friend Bob Wachter. He, as you know, his day job when he's there is being professor of medicine at the University of California at San Francisco. He has influenced many people's careers in hospital medicine, first with the article that he wrote a long time ago, I think it's 1996, back in New England Journal, where he talked about the hospitalist as a concept, and many people who were practicing inpatient medicine at that time picked up that magazine and said, hey, that's me. And I'm so glad somebody's finally organized it. But more than that, that he has trained some of our leading educators and then has thrown them to the winds, and they're in Michigan and in New Orleans and in Cleveland and all throughout the country, and they have gone on and influenced others in this field. His reach, he likes to write, and so he's published a lot, and you can read articles that he's written. He's the kind of person that thinks about something and writes it in a way that you say, that's exactly what I was going to say. He's a great writer, he's a great speaker, he's a great friend of SHM and a great friend of mine. It's a real privilege to invite to the stage Bob Wachter.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for staying to the bitter end. Thank you, Larry, for the generous introduction. Let me start with a few preliminaries to kind of get them out of the way. Some of you were here last year at the Mandalay, and ironically, even though this is April Fool's Day, I will not be doing anything nearly as foolish as what I did last year. I have to tell you that in the process of putting together this book that just came out that I'll talk about in a few minutes, I hired a public relations company, and their job is to sort of sell the book and sell me a little bit, and they kind of want to know what brand they're dealing with. And the director of the company called me a few days later, and he said, I've been looking through your stuff, and I've been on YouTube and looking through some of the things you've written, and it's all very impressive. You've got a pretty impressive CV, and there's a lot of stuff we can market here. He says, there's only one thing I think we need to talk about, though, and it was this. So people have asked me whether I can, how many of you were here for that? And you still came back. That's impressive. So people have asked me if I'm going to try to reach those heights or depths again, and the answer is not this year, maybe eventually. I'll forget what that felt like. This has been an extraordinary meeting. I've really enjoyed it. It's just great to see so many old friends and colleagues, and just want to sort of tip my hat to some folks here. We had a program, an amazing program put together by that hot Latino dancing fool. No, not that one. There we go, Efren. An amazing job, I think. The award winners have been extraordinarily impressive. I'm really proud of the fact that a fair number come from my group or people that I've worked with over the years, which is amazingly gratifying. We have a new president, Bob Harrington. Nope, not that one either. There we go. And I think Bob's going to be a tremendous leader, and Bob, I think, is our first family physician and maybe the first person in the presidency who's working largely in the post-acute space. And I think that is fabulous. Those of us who were the old geezers who were there at the beginning of this field grappled with whether we were going to be narrowly a community organization or an academic organization or just adult hospitalists or peds, and what the role of family medicine would be and what the role of the post-acute space was. And I think the decisions that have been made along the way to be as much of a big tent as possible have really paid off tremendously, and I think it's part of the strength that we have in numbers, so that has been great. Finally, two new masters of the society, Brad Flansbaum, really one of the most interesting thinkers in policy that I know of, and of course, Larry Wellikson. Nope, got that one wrong too. There we go. So, I have to say that I was one of the couple of people that hired Larry, and I mentioned this to him yesterday. One of the joys of my professional career is that I think I've probably hired a couple of hundred people over the years, and they are spectacular, have made an amazing contributions. And I'm not sure there's any person who's made more of a contribution to improving American medicine than Larry has. He is a complete piece of work. But his passion and his commitment for our field and for our patients is absolutely breathtaking, and I think has largely responsible for the success of the society. So Larry, thank you very much. Okay, so as has not been subtle, I have a book that just came out, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Team Health, thank you, bought a whole bunch of copies. I hope some of you got them for free. If you didn't, I'm sorry. You may have to go and buy it. This was the line for the book signing that happened the first day. I did a couple of hours of book signing. The line was extraordinary, but I think the most extraordinary thing about this line is if you look carefully, that's Win Whitcomb, one of the founders of the society, waiting online just to show how egalitarian the society is, that Win is sitting there waiting online for his chance. It was really fun. It was a little odd. A lot of people were taking pictures with me, and that was kind of cool. I thought they were doing it because I was some sort of rock star. I only realized later that I was one of the things on the scavenger hunt. They had absolutely no interest in me or the book. They just needed the picture for the scavenger hunt. You're supposed to talk about conflicts of interest, so I do. Those of you who already have a free book, this is a little bit muted, but not completely. This book has come out this week and has already sold about 10,000 copies and will probably launch when it officially comes out in the real world in the next week or so. Probably launch on some bestseller lists, which is incredibly exciting. Those of you who have it, I hope you like it, and it's actually something I'm very proud of. It's, I think, the best thing I've ever written. I spent the last year and a half just thinking really hard about the digital transformation of medicine and why it wasn't going as well as I think any of us had hoped. And I think the book has come out well. There is pretty tough competition, though, so I need your help. I need your support. Tell your friends. Review it on Amazon, because when you search for this book, The Digital Doctor, on Amazon, this is what comes up. I'm first, but Dr. Romance, Medical Erotica, I kid you not, this is what comes up. So I have to confess there is absolutely no sex in my book, so I think I'm in trouble in this competition. But anyway, let's get started. I am the furthest thing from a Luddite, and I think maybe what spoiled me and spoiled all of us was this guy. We got kind of spoiled by our iPhones. We have come to believe that we pick up a piece of digital technology and we download an app and off you go. You're making a plane reservation or an open table reservation or calling Uber. We thought this would be easy, and maybe if Apple had done it, it would have been. But it hasn't. And so it's funny that when you talk about being at least slightly critical of digital technology or concerned about it, people sometimes brand you a Luddite and say, oh, you're one of those people. Because there are people out there that say, let's exhume the 3-ring binders, let's pull out the cords, let's bring back the paper. I don't believe that at all. I actually think we have to digitize. We just have to do it better than we have so far. Just to show you that I am truly not a Luddite, And as you probably know, I blog and I tweet. I just believe deeply in technology. I even went forward and took a selfie. The brown one is not me, that's my dog Newman, those of you who are Seinfeld fans. We have to do this, but I don't think we've done it right so far. I personally have been struck by how hard it's been, and my idea for writing the book came about a year ago after seeing all sorts of unanticipated consequences and speed bumps. And then, as some of you have heard, I'll tell you a little bit more about this later, at my own institution, a fabulous institution, we gave a kid a 39-fold overdose to a common antibiotic, essentially because of the technology and the interactions between people and technology. So I came home one day and said, I have to write this. Luckily, my wife, who's a journalist, said the only way you're going to get this right is to do this journalistically, which means to go out and interview a ton of people. So I interviewed about 90, almost 100 people over the past year, CEOs of tech companies. I spent a day at Boeing, the federal directors of the national office in charge of technology, frontline docs, patients. And it was unbelievably interesting. And I think what at the end, was able to do was make some sense of why we are where we are and what the path forward might be. So that's what I'm going to do is tell you the story of what I've come to learn. I'll start at the beginning. In the same way when I talk about patient safety, I start with To Err is Human, because I think that was the start of the patient safety movement, the IOM report that came out in '99. I think the start of digitizing healthcare comes here with the State of the Union address by President Bush in January of 2004. And there's an interesting backstory to this speech. President Bush, if you remember, the Iraq War had launched about a year earlier. It had been going pretty well there. That was the mission accomplished speech on the aircraft carrier. Then it went sour. He was going to be coming up for re-election pretty soon. And he was looking for a domestic issue that he could pivot to, in some ways to take folks' attention off Iraq, and in some ways to burnish his reputation for the re-election campaign. He was trying to find a domestic issue that would have widespread support. Now, he was smart enough to realize, as President Obama realized 5 years later, that healthcare reform was probably not going to be that issue. But there was a single, smaller issue in healthcare that he thought might actually have support across the aisle, and that was computerizing healthcare. And so in the State of the Union address, he said, by computerizing health records, we can avoid dangerous mistakes, reduce costs, and improve care. All seems reasonable. There was a little bit of empirical evidence that some of these things might actually come true. He essentially put the federal government behind the idea that we should digitize healthcare. Now, I want you to think about that for just a second, because just the fact that he gave that speech is really interesting in and of itself. Can you imagine the president getting up and at the State of the Union address and saying, we're going to put the federal government behind digitizing shopping, digitizing the airline industry, you name every other industry? It would be ludicrous because those industries digitized on their own. The business incentives to go digital were so powerful that as soon as the technology was decent enough, they knew they had to implement IT tools or they would go out of business. In healthcare, it wasn't happening for a lot of reasons. The incentives are misaligned, as you all know. The products were clunky. The regulatory environment is tricky. There were a lot of reasons it wasn't happening naturally. And the president, I think, correctly perceived that this was what's known as a market failure, meaning you would think the market would make us go digital if it was good for us and for our patients. It wasn't happening. He decided federal intervention was important if it was going to happen. Not an unreasonable choice in my estimation. What he did was he set up an office, a federal office called the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology. That's a mouthful. Its nickname for short, its acronym was ONCHIT, that's with a C. Later shortened for obvious reasons to ONC, which is what it's called today. The first director of the Office of the National Coordinator, the first coordinator, was David Brailer. And he's a friend of mine. He actually introduced me to my wife, so I'm very fond of him. And David Brailer was given a budget by Congress to transform the American healthcare system of $42 million. Now, the American healthcare system is a $3 trillion industry. So this would be like trying to change the direction of a battleship by sticking your feet into the ocean and kicking really hard. Sort of pretty much impossible. And what David did with his $42 million was he convened and had conferences and talked about standards and kind of began moving the ball forward. But there was really not much he could do to transform the lack of a business case to go digital to make it happen. And so not very much happened for a few years. 4 years later, the other gentleman on the screen here, David Blumenthal, at the time a Harvard professor, now the CEO of the Commonwealth Fund, became the director of the ONC. And David Blumenthal's budget to transform the healthcare world into the digital version was a little larger than $42 million. It was $30 billion. Now, how did that happen in our political environment? That's sort of an amazing story, and a story really of happenstance and right place, right time. 2008, the economy implodes, Lehman goes bankrupt, we're going to have a depression, Bush administration's on the way out, Obama administration's on the way in, Congress passes an emergency $700 billion stimulus package. And the mantra was, we're going to use this money to fund projects, remember this, shovel-ready. They're going to fund shovel-ready projects. They were talking about roads and bridges and railways and things like that. They were not talking about computers in healthcare. But David Blumenthal, Zeke Emanuel, Bob Kocher, who spoke here a few years ago, sort of leaders in health policy who were in the Obama White House and the transition team, saw what they thought of correctly as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. They had this money pile of $700 billion sitting there. They saw this opportunity to dive into it and take out as much as they could for this purpose of digitizing American healthcare. They came out with $30 billion. Their fists were filled with $30 billion of money. That became what became known as the high-tech incentives. So over the next 4 or 5 years, that money was doled out to hospitals, probably yours and mine, and doctors' offices, with the purpose of getting us to go digital. Now, there's another policy, this gets often confused. There was another policy that accompanied high-tech. The high-tech was the money. Another policy that came along with it was called meaningful use. And what meaningful use was a set of standards that you needed to meet and your computers needed to meet in order for you to take the money. Again, that was not a ridiculous thing to do because the feds worried quite a bit, and I've spoken to all the policy people who were involved at the time. They worried quite a bit that this was a scandal waiting to happen. We would hand out $30 billion to hospitals and doctors' offices. They would use it to buy computers that would sit on shelves and not even be used. And so they felt they needed standards that allowed, ensured essentially that the computers were being used in the care of patients. In my book, I sort of go through the history of meaningful use. I won't go through it now because it's a little bit into the weeds. To me, it's quite interesting because it has gone from what seemed to me a reasonable policy now to being over-exuberant regulation, the federal government being very much deeply in the weeds in how our technology works, and I think actually it needs to pull back considerably. But at the time, none of this was crazy. The idea that the feds would get involved, get us to go digital, and create some standards to make sure we didn't waste the money or abuse it. That's a 71,000% increase, by the way, if you're keeping score. So really an amazing moment. I think it only could have happened because the economy imploded. Had the economy not imploded, I doubt this budget to digitize healthcare would have been $500 million. I think that would have been inconceivable given the politics. So really kind of a remarkable set of coincidences. Did it work? Well, it did actually. If you look at the percentage of doctors, offices, and hospitals that had electronic health records, in 2008, when high-tech was passed, it was 10%. Today, it's 70% and growing rapidly. Now, would some of that happen on its own because of the pressures under the ACA and just the natural state of affairs? I'm guessing, my own guess, we'd be up to 30% today. We certainly wouldn't be up to 70%. So if the measure, and this was the measure at the time, if the measure was, will federal intervention get us to essentially hit the tipping point and go digital, I think it worked. I actually think it was not an unreasonable policy. I think that what the folks were, their belief was at the time was that there was such resistance to going digital for all sorts of reasons that everybody understands, that without this push, it just would have taken forever. With this push, of course, there was going to be challenges with it, but at least we would become a digital industry. We would then begin to see some of the benefits of digital healthcare and also confront some of the challenges and work through them. None of that sounds or feels unreasonable to me. even in retrospect when you look at what happened. But what it meant, and why I think this is such a particularly interesting moment in healthcare, is most fields that go digital do so over the course of 10 or 20 years in a very organic way, with the early adopters and then sort of the rank and file and then the laggards. And in that kind of organic adoption curve, you see problems arise and people begin to deal with them and understand them and mitigate them, and that all sort of plays itself out naturally. I think what the federal intervention did was essentially turbocharge the digitization of healthcare. So we've seen this in a very, very telescope way. And that's partly why and I think as I've talked to people, a lot of you have been so sort of staggered by this, because all of the side effects have become clear. It's like we get started on a huge dose of chemo, like stat. And all the side effects became clear very, very quickly in ways that I think have been very surprising to many of us. So let me tell you about some of the things I observed before I get into kind of the meat of some of the issues that told me that this was kind of an interesting phenomenon, this watershed moment in healthcare where we really went from one way of doing work, an analog way, to a digital way of doing work. This is Rich Barron, another person I hired him to be the CEO of the American Board of Internal Medicine. He's having a tough time these days, as many of you know. He actually is a fabulous guy, and Rich, prior to taking over his role as the ABIM CEO a year and a half ago, ran a primary care, 4-person primary care practice. He's a real doc outside of Philadelphia. And Rich is kind of an early adopter type, and he likes technology. And he told me in about 2004, 2005, he turned 50, and he was having a bit of a midlife crisis. And he kind of was struggling one day, and he said, I want to do something really interesting and kind of big and different. And he said it was either going to be an affair, the red sports car, or computerizing his office. And he said computerizing his office seemed like the safest choice, so that's what he did. So about 10 years before most primary care practices, he bought an IT system, and he brought it into his office, and they tried very hard to sort of think through all the issues and plan for implementation. They implemented the system, as luck would have it, on Bastille Day, 2004. And Rich told me the staff came to work one day and nobody knew how to do their job, which I thought was a very profound comment. What he really meant was that there was a new practice of primary care in a digital environment. It wasn't like your iPhone where you turned it on and it just made life a little bit better and a little bit easier. It was a completely different way of organizing the work. What was fascinating was, I said, didn't you try to anticipate that? He said, of course we did. He said, the vendor actually came in and said, you need to think through everything you do so you can rethink it in a digital environment. He said, but you can't be smart enough to do that. There's no way to understand that. And I think that turns out to be true of all technologies. People have a limited vision to sort of imagine what life is like in a completely new environment. Henry Ford was reputed to have said, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And I think that gets at some of the issue here. Rich said we tried, but it wasn't until the thing was up and running that we said, like, what do you do with those Post-it notes? What do you do with a phone call? What do you do with the med refill? What do you do when the wife of the patient calls? All that sort of stuff that we're now well familiar with. Here was another kind of icon example where I kind of knew something interesting was going on. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times a couple weeks ago. You may have seen this. This was a 2014 advertisement for an ER job. They were looking for an ER doc in a suburban Phoenix hospital. And it starts off sort of standard ad lingo. Arizona General will be coming to the Grand Canyon later this year. It's in Levine, a suburb of Phoenix. Arizona General is a 40,000 square foot boutique general hospital. Now, who would not want to work in a boutique general hospital? And the ad went on. The services offered include an emergency room, which is good if you're looking for an ER doc. You really want to have that. A radiology suite with all the modern toys, 2 state-of-the-art ORs, outpatient surgery, 16 inpatient rooms, but the part of the ad that was in bold with a bigger font, it was clearly what they thought their biggest selling point was, no electronic medical record. I want you to think about that for a second. In 2014, a modern hospital is advertising that you can use pen and paper here. We will not make you use a computer. That was they thought their biggest advertisement. Now, I think that probably resonates with a lot of you. It was certainly not a lone example or a little area with a bunch of Luddites in it. I spoke to a guy named Mark Friedberg who ran a survey for the RAND Corporation that came out a couple of years ago that was asking about physician satisfaction with their practice. And the survey they were running was one that they ran 5 years earlier, and the survey did not have a single question about electronic health records or computers, because they hadn't asked that 5 years ago, and they like to keep it standard so they can compare. And Mark said, luckily, before they rolled out the survey, they did a couple of focus groups. And they were asking about, what do you think about CMS and paper performance and ACOs and all the usual stuff. And they were hearing the usual grumbling. And then somebody said, and how about your computer? And it was like they pushed this hot button and they could not get people to shut up about how their computer was this towering source of largely dissatisfaction in their practice. Luckily, they added the question to the survey, and it turned out to be probably the major source of dissatisfaction for many of the physicians. So I'm going to cover a few things. I'm going to talk about digital radiology. I'll tell you why in a second. I'm going to talk about our relationship with patients and each other. I'm going to talk about the birth of new kinds of errors and tell you about one particular case where that's become very clear. And I'm going to spend the last couple of minutes just talking about the tension between the computers and the people. And I'll do that by reading a 3-minute section of the book. Let's start with this gentleman. This is Wally Miller, the late Wally Miller. He was a professor of chest radiology at the University of Pennsylvania when I went to medical school there, which is many, many years ago. When I was a medical student at Penn, there was no question that the central hub of the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania was not in the C-suite. It was not in the OR of the most famous neurosurgeon or transplant surgeon. It was in Wally Miller's seat in the chest reading room. Because every day Wally Miller would hold court. Every day the medical teams and the surgical teams would come through the chest reading room like cars going through a car wash. And we'd stop, and Wally would be seated at his seat. He'd have his foot on the pedal, and that thing for young people behind who are here, that thing behind him is called an alternator. If you think about your dry cleaner, just turn it on its side and put up a thing in front of it called a film. I know you've never seen that, but that's what that is. He'd put his foot on a little pedal. It would spin around till it got to your films. He'd take his foot off the pedal. It would stop. They'd be lit up. And then Wally would say to the medical student, namely me, tell me what's going on. And I, shaking, would say, well, Dr. Miller, this is a 42-year-old woman with lupus, shortness of breath, and a cough, and we think she has pneumonia. And he would look, and he'd say, nah. And I'd start shaking, and he said, look at that. Does that look like pneumonia to you? And he'd tell you why it was tuberculosis or why it might be a fungal infection or who knows. Those rounds were unbelievably interesting, unbelievably instructive. Not only was the interchange between the frontline docs like us and the radiologists useful for both of us, but I actually think something even more powerful was going on, which is what they sometimes call sense-making. It was kind of the one chance we had every day to kind of stop the presses, think deeply about what was going on with our patients, and then kind of come up with a plan. And that's really what we did every day in the chest reading room. Here's another national leader in radiology. His name is Paul Chang. Paul Chang is a radiologist at the University of Chicago. He is also an informatics expert, and he was one of the leaders in digital radiology. Now, digital radiology has an interesting story because it didn't require federal incentives to go digital. It went digital, as you all know, with PACS about 15 years ago, and it did it on its own because the economics of it were unbelievably favorable. Why? Because in Wally Miller's day, when we got an X-ray, we got a chest film and had a PA and a lateral. It spat out 2 pieces of film. Now you get a CT or an MR, it spits out 100 pieces of film. And if you're going to print each of those, which by the way costs $4 an image, it's exorbitant. You need to cover the walls of this room to hang up one patient's image. The cost of digital storage were plummeting, and those two curves crossed in about the year 2000. And radiology, really over the course of a year or two, it's just like that, radiology went digital. PACS came in, and virtually every hospital went from analog to digital. Those charming alternators are now gone. I don't know where they are, but they're out of the hospital. Radiology is now a digital business. I've gone back to the literature to see if anybody speculated about what would happen to radiology rounds when radiology went digital. And I can find no one who even mused about what might happen to these rounds, these relationships that the radiologists had with the frontline clinicians. But I can tell you that the minute radiology went digital, those rounds ended. People know the teams no longer came through radiology to have this collegial interchange with their radiology colleagues. Why? Of course, because they didn't need to anymore, because they could see the film, which we now call the image. They could see it anywhere. Paul Chang's dad, as it turns out, is also a radiologist, and you would think that if your son invented this new field of digital radiology, was really famous in your own specialty, he would be extraordinarily proud of him. His nickname for his famous son is the man who ruined radiology. Now, I showed this about 5 years ago. I showed a slide of satisfaction among various specialties, and hospitals actually came out quite well. CT surgeons were the lowest because they trained for 42 years, and now nobody wants their services anymore because of catheters. And radiologists came out slightly below the mean. And I remember seeing that and saying that I think they didn't understand the question, because how is that possible? But it turns out that the field of radiology is incredibly angsty, because they actually miss those interactions, which have largely gone away because the forcing function of needing to go to radiology to see your films no longer exists. So I see digital radiology as the canary in the coal mine. I think there are lessons there for the rest of us that are now playing out. I think the lessons are that the digitization of the thing, in this case the film, creates the opportunity for us, our Silicon Valley friends like to say, infinite scalability, meaning it can be everywhere, and infinite distribution. It no longer is one incarnation called the film that lives in one place. Well, that leads to certain fascinating consequences. Social relationships and communication patterns that previously depended on gathering around the thing, in this case the film, will likely wither. And that's in fact what they did in radiology. Here's where it gets really interesting. Power relationships mediated by who controls the thing will be renegotiated. In the old days where the X-ray lived in radiology world, the radiologist had complete control over who saw the X-ray and who did the X-ray and who billed for the X-ray. Well, now, not so much. Now, as long as it's all fee-for-service, the radiology reading a film and sending off a bill to Medicare or Aetna, who cares? But now you're an ACO, or now you have a bundled payment, and now you begin to say, you know, the neurologists are pretty good at reading head CTs. Do we really need a second reading by a radiologist? That was a question you would not have asked before, or could not have asked before when you were in a film world, but now you can ask that question. Of course, the more profound and existential crisis for radiologists is the average US radiologist makes $400,000 a year, the average Indian radiologist makes $40,000 a year. Do we radiologists really need to be in the country? Again, a question you could not ask before, but you can now, and plenty of places are beginning to ask those questions, particularly as budgets get tighter. So the dynamics of how care is organized and how people get paid get completely upended when you go from analog to digital. Now, radiology is just, to me, a small slice of the world. What really is interesting is what happens when the thing is not the film, it's the medical record. And we're seeing examples of that throughout our worlds. Let me just give you a couple of examples. I see some of my colleagues here. Who is running the place, by the way, if all you guys are here? Certainly not me. We're very fond of this. This is the residence reading. This is the residence room. It's down the hall from my office on the 9th floor of UCSF Medical Center. It is packed day and night with residents and students on the computers, doing their work, chit-chatting, having a great time. Just out of view is a table on which there is food that is generally ridden with fungus. I mean, it's been there for 3 weeks, it's green, and yet will always be eaten. There is no food you can put down there that will not be eaten within a day. This is where the residents hang out and do their work, and God bless them, it seems like it's all fine, except then you go up to the medical service, to the ward, and it looks like that. Now, I have to say, on the day that I took this picture, I think I saw Brad Monash somewhere. Brad Monash was on the ward. I do remember, there he is over there. He was on the ward, so I had to wait till he was out of the picture. But this is not an unusual picture. The ward is empty. The nurses are still there, but the doctors are gone. Why are the doctors gone? Because in the old days, we used to hang out at the nurses' station because that's where the chart was. And the chart was where we learned, we read the labs and where we wrote our notes and we wrote our orders and all that. And we didn't think about it this way, but the chart and essentially the chart and the nurses' station, we were kind of yoked to this place called the ward. Well, once the chart went digital, we no longer were. So all of the effort that we've put in over the last several years to build teamwork on the floor and geographic units and all that, essentially are challenged in new ways. Does that mean we can't recreate it? I mean, places are doing some pretty impressive things to try to bring teams back together in a digital environment. But the point is, I didn't give this any thought. I don't know whether you did. It didn't cross my own cognitive radar screen that when we go digital, we will screw up the relationships because people now can be wherever they want to be to do their work. Now, I've been talking about collegial relationships, doctors and nurses. Let's talk about doctors and patients. This is all pretty familiar to you. Abraham Verghese, the Stanford professor and wonderful writer, coined the term the eye patient in a New England Journal article 7 years ago. It's a beautiful piece of writing and I think makes the point incredibly nicely. He says the patient is still at the center, but more as an icon for another entity clothed in binary garments, the eye patient. Often emergency room personnel have scanned, tested, and diagnosed so that interns meet a fully formed eye patient long before they meet the real patient. The eye patient's blood counts and emanations are tracked and trended like a Dow Jones index, and pop-up flags remind caregivers to feed or bleed. Eye patients are card flipped in what he calls the bunker, while the real patients keep the beds warm and ensure that the folders bearing their names stay alive on the computer. I think that's a fabulous piece of writing. It strikes me as entirely correct that we're increasingly taking care of the digital version of the patient rather than the patient him or herself. There's a lot of people in this room, and a lot of the abstracts in this meeting have been about how do we recreate those relationships. But I think the first thing we have to say is the computer has challenged them in ways that I think few of us expected. A picture, of course, is worth 1,000 words. Some of you have seen this picture. I think it's amazing. A 7-year-old girl went to visit her pediatrician several years ago. She drew a charming crayon drawing of a recollection of going to see the pediatrician. Many doctors take these beautiful pictures of their kids draw and put up on corkboards outside their office. This one I don't think made it up on the corkboard. There is the girl, her mother, her sister, and in the corner with his back to the patient is the doctor. If this should scare the hell out of all of us. I mean, this is what our patients are beginning to think we are doing, that we care more about what's in the computer than about them. Is this fixable? Over time, we'll figure out some voice recognition things. We'll figure out natural language processing. We'll think about the ergonomics of where the screen should go. There's all sorts of stuff we can do. But the fact that we didn't or anticipate this as a problem is really quite remarkable and fairly sad. Now, there is a cure for this. And some of you may already know the cure for this. And that is pre-medical students being hired to feed the computer. I see Jack. Jack, are you using Scribes yet? Your E. So mostly in ERs and primary care practices, not that many hospitalists yet. I found that amazing when I first heard that. I first heard about it a couple of years ago. And I came home to say to my wife, honey, guess what the fastest growing job in medicine is? And she says, well, you always tell me hospitalists. And I say, yes, I know, but this one's different. I said, it's scribes. It's sort of young people hired to feed the computer. And as some of you know, my wife writes for the New York Times. That's the article that she wrote that essentially brought scribes to national attention. Scribes are an amazingly interesting phenomenon because if you think about it, every other industry that known to man computerizes and lays off half the people. Only in medicine can we figure out a way of computerizing and adding FTEs. It's our kind of peculiar brilliance as an employment engine. But as far as what I've seen, this seems to be the best solution, and it's a ridiculous solution if you think about it, that we have to bring in another person to feed the computer. Okay, that's all I kind of wanted to say about relationships, the geography of medicine. I'm going to spend most of the rest of my time telling you about a case that happened at UCSF now a couple of years ago. They're running an excerpt of this case on this fabulous website called Medium this week. The graphics that they put together are extraordinary. So if you don't want to look at or buy the book, it's there for free on Medium. It's a 5-part excerpt, and it's already gotten about 60,000 views. So it's seemed quite interested. To me, this was the case that instructed me about the hazards of computerization. Let me tell you about it. And I tell you about it, by the way, with the permission of the patient's mother, you'll see in a second, all of the involved caregivers, and my institution, and I'm incredibly proud of my institution. When I tell you about the case, you'll understand why. A 16-year-old boy weighing 38.6 kilograms, that's 85-ish pounds for we non-pediatricians, with a chronic immunodeficiency, a genetic immunodeficiency, was admitted for a colonoscopy, a routine elective colonoscopy, as part of a workup for some GI bleeding he'd been having. The patient was on multiple home meds, probably about 10 of them. One of them was trimethoprim sulfa, or Septra, or Bactrim. 160 milligrams, the milligrams you dose Septra based on the trimethoprim component, so 160 milligrams of trimethoprim twice daily for prophylaxis. He'd been on it for years, chronic stable dose. The medical center recently installed a state-of-the-art electronic health record CPOE system. Ours was the best a lot of money can buy. It's called Epic. I'm imagining a fair number of you have the system. We switched to Epic several years ago. We started with a different system. I won't tell you which one it was, but I can tell you they make great light bulbs and jet engines, just not a very good computer system. And we ditched it about 3 years ago at a cost of several $100 million to switch to Epic, which is now in 9 of, if you believe US News and World Reports, it's now in 9 of, quote, America's top 10 hospitals. So Epic has clearly won the game among sort of big, particularly academic medical centers. And certainly when we were looking for a system, it was the best that we saw. At 1:09 in the afternoon, the admissions orders were written, including an order to administer to this teenager 38.5 Septra tablets. Let me repeat that. At 1:09 in the afternoon, the admissions orders were written, including an order to administer 38.5 pills. 9 hours later, a nurse gave him and the patient took 38.5 pills. 14 hours later, the patient had a grand mal seizure. A code blue was called. He was briefly apneic. Luckily, he survived. A week later, he left the ICU, and thankfully, he's doing well today, and I suspect he will never, ever have a urinary tract infection. Now, how could this happen? Let me start with, if you're normal, you're saying, how could they be that stupid, that careless? How could the computer system be that bad? You know, this is a fabulous hospital with amazingly great, careful, committed people. Again, this is the best computer system that money can buy, although the faint praise you probably have heard about Epic is often called the cream of the crap, but it is what it is. And I have, as I said, I've interviewed all of the involved practitioners, the doctor, the nurse, the pharmacist, the IT people who helped build the system. I've spent a day at Epic interviewing senior leaders, including the president. These are all good people trying to do the right thing, but it hasn't worked. Now, I also want to say as a caveat, there is no question in my mind that our hospital is safer now that we have our computer system than before. There is no question in my mind that it has prevented many, many medication errors and all sorts of other errors. That is, to me, is incontrovertible, but it is capable of breathtaking errors, and this is a case that I think illustrates that. As I say, in order to talk to you and to write about this case, first I approached our risk manager, and I said, I'd like to write about this case and, you know, in a book. It took a little while to put her hair out, which was on fire. Ultimately, she approved it, the chief medical officer approved it, and the CEO of the medical center approved it. So I see that as an act of incredible organizational bravery. And I believe that part of why we're not making headway is we don't talk to each other about these kinds of cases. Sometimes we think it was our fault, or I don't type well, or who knows what the problems are. But I think this is an area where we have to be more open about it. There's a peculiar challenge in talking about IT cases. The screenshots I showed you here, I needed to get permission from the company to show you. It was not all that easy to get those screenshots because there's a contractual arrangement that says I'm not allowed to just show them to you, even if they help contribute to an error. I think that's a substantial problem. All right, let's talk about how it happened. Here is the intended order. 1 double-strength Septra twice a day. Kid was on it for several years. The resident who was admitting the patient knew that dose. That was what she wanted to give this patient. But she wasn't allowed to do that in the kind of medication safety system that we designed. Here is, again, with EPIC's permission, one of the screenshots. This is what she needed to do. There is a rule in pediatrics that, and you set the rules yourself, we set a rule, doesn't seem to me to be a bad rule, that for kids less than 40 kilograms, again about 80, 85 pounds, we need to use weight-based dosing. I'm not a pediatrician. I have a bunch of med-peds folks in my group who are terrific, and they tell me that this is a reasonable thing to do. And you can see why. If you're dosing a med for a preemie versus an obese adolescent, you can't be using the same dose. So you had to come up with some cutoff. We came up with a cutoff that said the policy is when you're going to dose a kid who's less than 40 kilograms, you have to use weight-based dosing. Reasonable. What that meant was even though she knew the correct dose of 1 double strength twice a day, that was the kid's dose, he'd been on it forever, she was not by policy allowed to order that. She needed to sort of back calculate what that is in weight-based dosing, and she goes to the order screen, and what she does is click on that 5 milligrams per kilogram of trimethoprim. That's double strength, so that's the larger size. What that click does is populate that little box, 5 milligrams per kilogram trimethoprim, a little bit of math, and it does a calculation and says, well, that's 193 milligrams, if you do the math. The pill, which is what she wanted to get to in the first place, is 160 milligrams. That's what the kid was on. Those are different, but rounding off 193, the closest pill size is 160. All perfectly reasonable. She clicks sign. And when she signs this order, she believes she has signed an order for 1 pill twice a day, precisely what she intended to do. That's what she believed. And if she was right, all would have been well, but she wasn't. We have another policy. The next policy is that doses that are rounded from the calculated dose to the available pill size by more than 5% need to be reconfirmed and re-entered by the doctor. Again, not unreasonable should that number be 5 or 10 or 15, who knows. This case, if you've been doing the math, it's 17%, rounding down from 193 to 160. What's that policy about? Well, you can imagine if you're rounding down from 193 to 60 and the pharmacist calls the doc might say, no, actually, I don't want to do that, I want to round up. Or can we give 1.5 pills, or all sorts of things. So that was the policy. The pharmacist is not simply allowed to approve a medicine if that difference is more than 5%. Because of that policy, the pharmacist needs to text page the doctor, which is what the pharmacist does. This is the actual text page. Doses rounded by more than 5%. Correct dose, 160 milligrams, please reorder. The doctor goes back to the CPOE screen and enters the number 160 in the dose box. Anybody notice a problem? All right, good. So the computer, in the way we've set up EPIC, again, perfectly reasonable, the way we set up EPIC, because our policy is anybody under 40 kilograms, milligrams per kilogram, that's what you should use. When you go back to that screen, it is still defaulted to milligrams per kilogram. She does not notice that. Now, I want you to think for a second, put yourself in her shoes. You're admitting 3 or 4 sick kids, each on an average of 15 different medications. Your beeper is going off like a machine gun. Raise your hand if you're 100% sure you would have noticed that. I saw somebody maybe like that, but then thought the better of it. I wouldn't have. There's no way I would have, or I can't be sure about it. There's certainly nothing on this screen that screams out that you're now on milligram per kilogram versus milligram mode, even though the consequences of those 2 modes in this case are a 38.5-fold difference in the dose. She does not notice it. And at the bottom of the screen, if you look carefully enough, that's 38.5 tablets. And she clicks sign. Now, EPIC's not stupid. It fires an alert. And the alert looks like this. This is an actual reproduction of the alert that she received. And you see, if you're looking for the number 160, it's there. It's embedded in the number 6,160. There's a lot of text. It says overdose there, but it's sort of buried in the middle of a text-heavy screen. You've seen many of my colleagues and residents give presentations this week, and we work with them on graphics and making screens interesting. This would have been a screen that we would have rejected because it's so text-heavy. There's no graphics. There's nothing to come up and signal you that something important is going on here. She, as you would guess, overrode this warning. We asked her, why did you override the warning? She described her first week at UCSF, where she was admitting a bunch of sick kids, and on each one, essentially, you'd get 3 or 4 or 5, sometimes on one patient, you'd get, or on one order, you get 3 different alerts. And she said, she asked her resident, how I get my work done? The resident said, just ignore the alerts. That was sort of the unspoken culture because the alerts were so extraordinarily exuberant. She clicked out of this alert. And by the way, the appearance of this alert, which is a 38.5-fold overdose, looks essentially the same as a 0.1% overdose. It looks the same as don't give this medicine with grapefruit juice. Really pretty extraordinary. Epic's newer version is slightly better in that regard. There is a graphic for a severe alert. That was not true in the version we were using. I had a chance to spend a day at Boeing headquarters, which was one of the most interesting things I did to see how their designers thought about alerts. I also interviewed a researcher at our place named Barbara Drew, who's a nurse who studies alerts in the ICU. Barbara did a study of the 70 ICU beds at UCSF Medical Center to see how often, now we're not talking about the computer alerts, we're talking about that cardiac monitor, heart rate, oxygen saturation, EKG tracing, how often that monitor goes off in the course of a month. Take a guess. Jack, you're here to take a guess. How many times in a month do you think that monitor, the cardiac monitor, goes off? First, all 70 beds, not one patient, but all 70. 70,000. All right, anybody, Efren? 70,000? You like that? A little less than 70. 70,000 seems pretty crazy, yeah. It was 2.5 million. 2.5 million times that cardiac monitor went off and sent off an alert for one of the nurses that something was wrong with one of the patients in the ICU. There was one audible alert every 7 minutes. Barbara told me a story about interviewing a nurse standing by the bedside, and the alerts are just going off, and beepers and all sorts of things. And she said to the nurse, like, how would you even know that something was wrong with one of the patients? What would get you scared? And the nurse thought for a second, and she said, silence. She said, if there was no alert, I would really be worried that something was going on. Think about that. I mean, how bad a system that is. So I spent a day at Boeing. I got a chance to fly the 777 simulator, which was unbelievably cool. I crashed it, unfortunately, on landing, because you actually have to know how to fly it. And they talked to me about how they think about alerts. And the way they think about what's known as user-centered design was incredibly inspiring. These are incredibly smart computer engineers, and they say, we put in the computers, we put in the signals. I mean, there's about 10,000 things that are being recorded on every flight, and we could signal the pilots about all of them. But we do the best we can, and then we watch the pilots fly the plane in simulators and for thousands of hours in real use with no passengers, and look at what happens. And we constantly are surprised, and what we do, one of the things we always do is we start pulling out alerts. Because we say, we know that every false alarm makes it less likely. Every false alarm is dangerous. It makes it less likely you'll pay attention to a real one the next time. We've done none of that in healthcare. In our system, the pharmacists there are 300,000 medications ordered a month at UCSF. The pharmacists are alerted on 150,000 of them. The doctors are alerted on about 25 or 30,000 of them. That means that we have not paid any attention to this idea of user-centered design. Peter, the first day, talked a little bit about how they're trying to integrate some of the alarms. Some of the answer will come that way. So, for example, you're brushing your teeth in the ICU, and the computer thinks that your heart rate is 250, but your blood pressure is not changed. It's physiologically impossible. If those machines were talking to each other, that would not fire an alert. Of course, it does today. So there's a huge amount we have to learn. The other thing the Boeing folks told me was, as I was describing the fact that the alerts all look the same, 39-fold overdose, 1% overdose look the same, they were shocked by that. And I said, is that what you do? They said, no. They said, we have these graded set of alerts, and they completely depend on how serious it is. So if the plane is stalling and is going to crash if you don't do something, that is the highest level alert. The color red shows up in the cockpit, and it's the only time we are allowed to use the color red. That's how thoughtful they are. They will not use red any other time, but for you need to pay attention right now. There's that computer voice, the steering wheel starts shaking. That's the plane stalling, you need to react right now. I said, okay, what happens for lower level alerts? I said, well, a lower level alert might just be amber, or it might be red, but there's no shaking and there's no voice. That's how they're prioritized. I said, give me an example of kind of a lower level alert, something the pilot needs to know about but not react to this second. And the chief engineer for Boeing's fleet said to me, okay, one of the engines is on fire. And I said, you got to be kidding me. That is a lower level alert. He said, yeah, it's not a big deal. The plane puts it out just fine. We think the pilot should know. I said, oh, terrific, good. That's great. One of the things I came to learn in talking to the Boeing people, which was I hadn't expected, was when I asked them, why are you so thoughtful about paying attention to the user's experience? First of all, it's important to say they've got a much easier job than Epic or Cerner or any of the companies because they build the whole thing. They can see it as a unified ecosystem. Epic and Cerner and Athena, they don't own hospitals or clinics. So they have to do more work to see what the user experience is. But I think they need to, and they haven't. When they talked about why they do, they talked about it in two kinds of ways. One was very pragmatic. We'll do a better job if we observe user experience and take that into account. But then they said something to me that, as I wrote about it and talked about it, almost seems hokey, but felt very real. They said, we have deep reverence for the pilots and their experience. And we know that the lessons that they have learned in many cases from dying because we didn't know those lessons. How could we not pay total attention to those lessons? And it almost sounds like a Hallmark card when I say it, but it was so real. I can tell you I spent dozens and dozens of hours with IT vendors, good, solid people trying to do the right thing. I never heard anybody say anything that remotely resembled that. I think what I heard from them had a subtext many times of, we kind of understand engineering, doctors and nurses, they don't kind of get it. A lot of them are just kind of technophobes. They're not ready to do digital work. We're producing really good tools. If you sit in a shelter away from clinical practice, I could see how you would think that way, but it really doesn't work, and I think is part of the genesis of our problems. All right, let's get back to the case. Remember, at this moment now, we have a licensed physician who has now signed an order for 38.5 pills and clicked through the alert. The order pings back to the pharmacy. The pharmacy's job is to make sure that the medicine is delivered safely. Except we've got a little problem here. The pharmacy involved here was the satellite pharmacy. 4 pharmacists are working in a space the size of a parking spot. I spent a couple hours watching them do their work. While they're in this space, basically bumping to each other, not only going through, remember 150,000 alerts, half of the medications get alerts, not only are they doing that, but they're also answering the phone, they're also answering the door, they're kind of mixing up meds, they're doing all this stuff, they're multitasking. The pharmacist received the signed order back from the physician. There's a little bit of confirmation bias here. Remember, the pharmacist texts the doctor saying order 160. It comes back and there is the number 160. Your brain is programmed to see what it expects to see. That's what the pharmacist sees. She approved the order. She got an alert that was every bit as text heavy and in some ways uninformative as the one the resident got, and she overrode that alert. Okay, so now you have a signed order and a confirmed order by a doctor and a pharmacist. Now, in the old days, the order would have gone printed out in a label printer, would have gone to a pharmacy tech who would have picked up a big vat of Septra, started pouring it out, and about halfway through would have said, "What the hell?" and would have tapped the pharmacist on the shoulder. But that's not what happens now. Any guesses what happens now? Let me introduce you to our robot. This is a $7 million Swiss-made pharmacy robot, state-of-the-art. When it sees an order for 38.5 Septra pills, it says in robot language, "Thank you. I can do that." And it pulls off the shelves 38 pills, shrink wraps them, barcodes them, sticks them on little plastic rings, puts them in little bins, sticks them in a van, and sends them to the floor. In case you want to see what 38.5 pills, shrink wrapped and barcoded, look like, this is exactly what this kid's dose looked like when it was sent over to the floor. Where a young nurse sees the order in her electronic medication administration record to give this kid 38.5 pills. She's in her first year of work at UCSF. She's floating out of the PICU. She normally worked in the pediatric ICU. This was only her second time in a year floating on an unfamiliar floor. There was a shortage that day on the general peds floor. She was unfamiliar with the floor, unfamiliar with the type of patients. It doubles as a research floor. She started thinking, I wonder if this is a research kind of dose or something. She did what humans do to try to make sense of things that really make no sense. She thought, obviously, this seemed like an unusually large dose. She considered asking her charge nurse, but her charge nurse was off giving another kid chemo, and we've been harping on everybody not to interrupt each other when they're doing critical, exacting tasks. She considers asking the patient's mom, who was virtually always by her son's bedside, and obviously if a nurse had come in to give her kid 38.5 pills, she would have tackled the kid. But as luck would have it, this teenager has a brother with the same genetic disease who was hospitalized that day on a different floor and was sicker than his brother. That's where mom was at the time, so she was out of the room. So the nurse, after going through all these machinations in her head and a little bit of, I'm kind of new on this floor and I don't understand what's going on and I don't want to look dumb, she says, I know to get to me, it seems like a weird dose, but I know to get to me it had to go through a doctor, a pharmacist, a robot, and I'll check it again with the barcode machine. And so she barcodes pill number 1, and guess what the barcode machine says? It says, I need to see 37.5 more. Because at that stage of the medication safety process, I hadn't realized this till I kind of went through this case. Medication safety process has 2 very distinct phases. The first phase, which is the doctor and pharmacist, is let's be sure you're ordering the right medicine for the right patient, the right dose. Then it toggles into something completely different, which is let's be sure to the nurse that you're giving the medicine as it's written. So it's now a perversion. Now the technology is telling the nurse that this ridiculous order is correct. And that is just enough to convince her, okay, it must be right. And so picture this next time you're in the supermarket. She scans 38 pills, one after another, tears them open, puts them in a glass, gives them to the kid. When I interviewed her, I said, what were you thinking when this kid was taking 38.5 pills? She said, I was thinking, what a trooper, what a good kid he is. And then she stopped for a second and started crying. How crazy is this dose? This would be like driving down the highway and seeing a speed limit sign for 2,500 miles an hour. And just to show you, I showed you what the pills look like in their shrink-wrap barcoded packages on the rings, just to show you what it actually looked like for the kid. I did this at home, so I did it in a wine glass, and I didn't have any Septra, so these are my Centrum Silvers, but that's essentially what it looks like. Really quite extraordinary. Before the kid had his grand mal seizure, he sent a text to a friend, they're having me take an awful lot of pills and drink an awful lot of liquid. The liquid was the Go Lightly for the colonoscopy that he never actually had during this hospitalization. All right, last few minutes I want to take you through what are the lessons from the case. You're all familiar with the Swiss cheese model, the way we think about errors. Clearly, we created a set of policies that rendered what should have been something very simple into something that was, in the end, hopelessly complicated. We also chose at the time not to build any hard stops. We since have rethought that, although it's actually not an easy thing to do in EPIC. Alert fatigue, a huge issue. The lack of user-centered design, I think, is a profound issue in this case, that the screens, we are not set up for success in the way these systems were designed. A stressed workforce, difficult working conditions, production pressures, over-reliance on the machine, a huge problem in every industry that goes high-tech, aviation struggling with the same thing, that the machines get so good. There's an article written about 25 years ago called The Irony of Automation, and the irony is as the technology gets better, the role of the human becomes more, not less important. And that's because the humans increasingly turn their brains off and over-rely on the machines. That's part of what happened here. You also have to think about the cultural issues. And when I interviewed the nurse, and she said, I didn't really want to call somebody because I worried about looking dumb. That's how we gave a massive overdose of Septra. Peter brought up Ron Heifetz in his talk on the first day, and I'll bring him up again because I do think that's part of the problem. I think we approach technology as a technical problem. Just sort of put it in, turn it on, it's good. It's an adaptive problem of the highest order. And Heifetz wrote, adaptive problems are problems that require people themselves to change, In adaptive problems, the people are the problem and the people are the solution. Leadership is about mobilizing and engaging the people with the problem rather than trying to anesthetize them so that you can go off and solve it on your own. I think that's the nature of the problem. I think that's why our involvement in this is so absolutely critical. You might say, oh, the only way this can get fixed is EPIC's got to fix it, or Cerner's got to fix it, or federal government has to fix it. But there's a huge amount that we need to do and can do by putting pressure on them, by redesigning our systems. The history of technology and technological improvement in every industry is that you get there eventually. And you get there partly because the technology gets better, but partly because you reimagine the work. And I think that is our core role. So what we need to do is we need to push this idea of user-centered design, both in our own institutions and with our vendors. We need to figure out how do you make care better in a digital era. The notes are terrible now. Now that's partly because of copy and paste, but we also need to learn how to write a good note in a digital era. Just because you can copy and paste and write a worthless note does not mean you have to. And we haven't really approached it, I think, in the right way. Just because we no longer hanging around in the nurse's station, we need to reimagine how we improve communication in a digital era. We have to address alert fatigue. We have to disseminate the cases, I think, like this one, because I don't think we've been talking to each other enough. At the federal level, I think the role of government is crucial. I think the government did the right thing with high tech. I think getting us to go digital was correct, but I think now they're too far into the weeds. And the analogy I like is that of the internet, where if you think about it, in the early days, the federal government was incredibly involved in the early development of the internet, but then pulled way, way back. And the internet now is managed essentially privately and by not-for-profits, and it works quite well. I'm going to leave you with one final thought, because we've been talking about tech and errors, but I kind of want to bring this back to patients. So I'm going to read a very short section from the end of the book, which tries to make a point that I want to leave you with. A couple of years ago, I was caring for a patient in his 70s, let's call him Mr. Gordon, in the ICU at UCSF. This was a challenging case. While it was clinically obvious that the patient, who had widely metastatic cancer, was going to die, several members of the family had not come to terms with this sad reality. Layered on top of that, I sensed significant conflict within the family. The patient's son and daughter were cool toward each other, nearly businesslike, and the son and the daughter's husband could stand to be in the same room. As Mr. Gordon drifted in and out of consciousness, I sat down with his family in a conference room just outside the unit. The family tension suffused the room with a heavy air, the smog of long-standing resentment. I described the clinical situation. I told them how it was that we were sure that Mr. Gordon was dying. I gave them my assessment that ongoing aggressive care would be futile and inhumane. I recounted my consultation with the ICU specialists, the oncologists, and the palliative care team, all of whom endorsed my prognosis and approach. I told them that I understood their desire to keep Mr. Gordon alive, but that I believed the time had come to stop trying. After talking for a while, the family members began to describe some happy memories of their times with Mr. Gordon and recalled his attitudes about end-of-life care. It became clear he would not have wanted aggressive care at this stage. I could feel the family members gradually casting aside their grievances, if only temporarily, as they coalesced around his interests. Their questions answered, I left the room and returned to the ICU. A few minutes later, Mr. Gordon's son, holding back tears, found me in the ICU and told me that the family had decided that it was time to allow his dad to die peacefully. I replied that I understood how wrenching this decision was, but that it was the right one that I would make for one of my own parents. He went back to the waiting room to rejoin his family. I entered Mr. Gordon's room and informed the nurse that we would be switching from our current full-court press to comfort care. I asked him to turn down the oxygen on the ventilator, to remove all the IVs except for the one for morphine, and to bring some chairs into the room to allow the family to be at Mr. Gordon's bedside during his final minutes. I walked out to the waiting room to inform the family that the time had come, and then escorted them in to see Mr. Gordon for the last time. They entered the room one by one. The two siblings embraced. The son and the son-in-law nodded at each other, an act I interpreted as a momentary truce, and all four took seats surrounding the patient's bed. Mr. Gordon lay still, now unconscious from his morphine drip. The stage was set, but then I noticed a problem. In his haste to discontinue the various tubes and treatments, the nurse had forgotten to disconnect the bedside cardiac monitor, which continued to flicker a few feet above Mr. Gordon's head. And so it was that at one of life's most profound moments, a moment nearly impossible in its mystery and poignancy, a moment paradoxically rich with promise and ineffable sadness, all four family members' eyes were raised, not searching for truth or for God, but watching little squiggles, each the electronic signature of a heartbeat, march across a rectangular screen. Mr. Gordon's son was sitting closest to the monitor. I put my hand on his shoulder. Speaking to all of them, I said, "Your dad is comfortable, and I'm so glad you could all be here with him. I'm sure he is too. But," and I pointed to the heart monitor, "there is absolutely nothing on this screen that matters." And I pressed the off button. As the screen went to black, the family members shared a look of shock, then clarity, and then, what was it? Acceptance, warmth, gratitude, transcendence, maybe even love. After a moment of gathering themselves, each turned to Mr. Gordon, squeezed his hands, stroked his arm, touched his cheek. The scene was pure, peaceful, and, in a way that is hard to describe, quite beautiful. And then he died. Thank you so much for your attention.
Good afternoon. My name's Melissa Mettison, and I'm going to try to follow that wonderful talk by Bob Wachter with a quick review of what we have learned at Hospital Medicine 15. I would like to thank the annual meeting committee who helped us create the curriculum and worked very hard to put this meeting together. But I would also like to send a huge shout out to the Society of Hospital Medicine team and staff, Teresa Jones, Catherine, Megan, I could go on and on. Thank you very much for your efforts. It's very much appreciated. Thank you also to Efren. I've got big shoes to fill for Hospital Medicine 16, but it's going to be terrific. Before we get there, I'd like to thank our exhibitors and our sponsors. The speakers, we had some fantastic speakers at this annual meeting. And you, the attendees. And those of you who tweeted, I have to say thank you. It has been a tremendous way to keep track of what's happening. There's no way anyone could be at all of the various tracks at any given time, but through that Twitter feed, you can almost virtually keep track of what's happening and see what you've missed. If you missed something, you weren't quite able to catch it, Hospital Medicine 15 is available on demand with free access. You can catch it at this link. There are select presentations available in 3 tracks, the rapid fire track, medicine, medical education, and the potpourri track, so check it out. We all need our CME credit, of course. You will receive a prompt via email to complete your CME, your course evaluation to get your CME. You'll be directed to the SHM Learning Portal, and at that portal, you'll fill out the evaluation, and once the evaluation is complete, you'll be able to print your CME certificate right there. As Larry said, we had 3 of the top leaders in quality improvement speak to us over the past few days. We've had some tremendous talks. I do prefer this picture of Bob. I know that he said he wouldn't sing. He did do a good job, I would say, today in speaking with us and giving us some great perspective. But I liked last year's singing, I must say. The content for this year's annual meeting is really amazing and cutting edge and exactly what hospitalists in the United States and around the world need. We talked about ways to be cost conscious, to provide optimal care, really utilizing our resources as best as we can. There was a lot on population management, performance improvement, and we had a new pre-course this year for the first time ever run by Diane Slivka on patient experience. For those of you who attended it, it was terrific. You missed out if you were not there. And along those lines, we had 2 new tracks. One was the doctor-patient relationship, which included some similar topics to the pre-course. We also had the young hospitalist track, which was tremendously popular and helped grow our pipeline of up-and-coming hospitalists. Dr. Pronovost spoke on Monday about reasons why his efforts to stamp out central line associated bloodstream infections worked. He highlighted 3 things. He said, you have to have enabling infrastructure, engaged clinicians, and transparent reporting with accountability. He encouraged all of us to create improvement through inspiration. We just heard a very inspiring talk. But all of that would be for naught if we don't provide the resources, the infrastructure, and the time to ourselves and our colleagues to do that. Dr. Pronovost told us a story about a surgeon who was being tasked with improving something in the surgical suite, and the surgeon did not have the skills, the toolbox, or the wherewithal to do what he was being asked in a quality improvement way. And yet he was being reprimanded, and he said that the surgeon quote was, "Help me, don't whip me." So we need to remember that. And lastly, avoid the monsters in the bathroom. For those of you who were at that talk, he told us the story about the electronic flush toilets that had been recently installed in his son's elementary school, and that the faculty and teachers had not warned the children, and the children thought that there were monsters in the bathroom. Maureen Bisignano gave us a tremendous talk as well. I tried to think about how I could begin to summarize what she said, and I think that what I really took home from that is this one question. One question that if I can remember to ask my patients will help me be a better doctor and provide better care. What would be a good day for you? What would be a good day for you? And there was a very inspiring video she showed us. It is available on YouTube. If you go and you search, the title of that video is A Soul Doctor and a Jazz Singer. We just heard Bob telling us about the implementation of the electronic health record. In true Bob speak, it's the mother of all adaptive changes. We've been spoiled by our iPhones. We thought it would be easier than it is. We have to improve systems, and we must rethink the way we do our work in the digital age. The Young Hospitalist track was fantastic, run by Dan Steinman and colleagues. They had talks on how to find your job, how to find the right job for you. How do you write your CV? How do you manage your time? How do you make the most of mentoring relationships? The doctor-patient relationship track, similarly, a tremendous asset to this program this year. A lot on communication, different styles of communication, where we can use different communication strategies in family meetings, end-of-life discussions, discussions about professionalism, discussions about how do we assess our patients' capacity to make medical decisions. Some nuts and bolts. Dan Dressler gave us a great update in pulmonary and critical care medicine. We learned that in sepsis and severe shock, you use crystalloid for volume expansion. Albumin and other crystalloids, no added value. In COPD exacerbations, we know that moderate dose steroids in patients in the ICU are at least as effective as high dose steroids. And if you're trying to extubate a patient with COPD who's been intubated in the ICU, bridge them with non-invasive positive pressure ventilation. For acute PE, there's a lot of stuff here at Hospital Medicine about anticoagulation. The target-specific oral anticoagulants for acute PE and the novel oral anticoagulants are not inferior for the treatment of PE compared to standard, more traditional therapies, and actually may have a lower risk of bleeding. We also know that if you have RV dysfunction, myocardial damage, and you're getting worse clinically, you likely would benefit from lysis. But the jury's still out. We need more information about how one's age might affect one's prognosis if you're going to get lytics, what should the dose be, how should it be delivered. Julia Ragland talked to us about end-of-life discussions, and she brought up the issue of prognostic awareness. She taught us that prognostic awareness is absolutely critical so that our patients and their families can make informed decisions around the end-of-life care. And we as hospitalists really play a very pivotal role in providing that information to the patient and family. How might you do that? She provided us this framework: ask, tell, ask. Ask the patient, what do you understand? And what do you want to know? And then tell the patient. Tell them the best case scenario, the worst case scenario, and give them a range. And then pause, and then ask them again, what do you understand? What more do you want to know? Our pediatric colleagues taught us that single-site osteomyelitis can be safely treated with oral antibiotics at discharge. And for children with community-acquired pneumonia, ampicillin is safe and effective, and you don't need to test for viruses. Ethan Kumbler gave a very dynamic presentation about delirium management, and he reminded us about the FDA alert and the black box warnings about the use of antipsychotics, traditional and atypical. For the use of those class of medications in patients with dementia, it's not a great idea. They should be reserved only for patients with severe agitated delirium. I'll say that again, only for patients with severe agitated delirium in whom you have no other course of action. And if you find that you give your patient an antipsychotic during their hospitalization, make sure that you don't discharge them on an antipsychotic if you can help it. And if you do discharge them on an antipsychotic, it should be like a prednisone taper. It should be clearly outlined that this is not a medication that they should be on forever. We love to risk stratify, don't we? We're hospitalists. We risk stratify perioperative risk and so on. Well, we learned from Bridgen Shaw that we need to risk stratify constipation at the time of admission. In fact, he advocates that we should ask our patients about their constipation history, and if they are constipated at baseline, when they come in the hospital, we need to monitor them more carefully and provide them prophylaxis that is more aggressive than their outpatient regimen. If they have severe constipation in-house, no obstruction or ileus, you should do a rectal exam, and you might consider a modified bowel prep. We had a couple of surgeons come and give us a very nice talk this morning. Jason Johanning and Mark Caddick came and talked to us about frailty. How do we decide, should we operate or not on our most frail patients, high-risk patients? They taught us that frailty is a very good marker to identify vulnerable surgical patients and ones who will have complications. And back to the issue of communication, they highlighted this in their talk as well. We really need to achieve patient-focused, patient preference outcomes. And you may need to consider a palliative care consult. And we have to kind of tease out with our surgical colleagues, when do we rescue the patient in the postoperative period and maybe provide more aggressive care transiently versus not? Steve Pontolat taught us about a family meeting. He says it's like a procedure. There's 5 things you need to do. You need to remember what the reason for the meeting is. You need to prepare for the meeting before you have it. And when you show up at the meeting, you need to introduce yourself. You need to understand what the family knows, share with them what you know. And in the middle, reflect. What would the patient say if they could see themselves lying in bed? At the end, establish a point person for the medical team, point person for the family. Review the decisions you made and follow up plans that will occur. And don't forget to document what you've discussed. And all along the way, encourage the family to speak and participate. Ask them open-ended questions like, what have the doctors told you? And be empathic. So Hospital Medicine 15 There are multiple tracks, and we have put on a tremendous meeting. I hope you've all enjoyed it. Thank you for staying and listening. I would like to remind you that next year we're going to be in sunny Southern California, March 6th through 9th. So go ahead, register. You can register online already, or you could register here at the meeting. It's going to be a tremendous meeting, and thank you for coming here, and we'll see you next year.